So I introduced the topic. I will let everyone introduce themselves, starting with David.
I am David, founder and CEO of Permissionless Labs, maker of Pipe Network.
Hi, I'm Matt Stevenson. I'm an economist and I'm a research partner at Pantera Capital.
Hey everybody, Scott Siegel, COO of the Helium Foundation.
Awesome, great having you guys. I kind of wanted to start with your perspective on what the value unlock is of DePIN. So maybe more on the theoretical level and maybe touching a bit on practical progress we're seeing so far and what specific spaces we're seeing that in. Let's start with David.
Yeah, I think from my team in particular, focused on content delivery, the value unlock is getting closer to the user. So like currently in our industry, like CDNs, the pop nodes are like 150 miles away from the user. And crypto is the first mechanism to incentivize getting these caches very close down like the neighborhood level. So it's like very unique from like an engineering perspective for us.
Good. Yeah, I would say what I consistently value in DePIN is the ambition and the attempt to do big things, which I think is really, really cool and pretty much universally shared with the projects in the space, which I think is really cool. In terms of how we particularly value it, or I particularly value it and evaluate it, I usually focus on keeping monitoring costs low and keeping capital costs low as the two big things. And there's some details around that, but basically just looking into ways that you can manage the sort of Oracle problem that DePIN naturally sets up and making sure the sort of like cost outlays for what users are going to have to purchase or what they're going to have to supply make some sort of economic sense over time.
So I think in terms of value unlock, DePIN is solving very much. There are problems in traditional in industries that are looking for solutions, and a lot of DePIN, specifically wireless, which is what Helium is focused on, is this new way to build wireless networks. Is where wireless networks have historically been a top-down, high capex model, where tens of billions are spent every single year, where you're putting up towers, you're owning that real estate, the operating costs that go along with that, and it's all in the service of returning value to shareholders for these large telcos. So they're thinking about density, they're thinking about subscriber traffic. So how do you actually get to wireless sprawl? You have to have these bottoms-up models where anybody has that ability, has the agency, and has the economic incentive to be able to deploy that out. So, in terms of value that's actually happening right now, the idea that, within wireless and for Helium, that we're seeing these traditional telcos, these very legacy entrenched incumbents, leaning on decentralized physical networks now to solve these gaps in coverage and kind of close that digital divide. Like that is happening in real time every day now.
Great. So Matt was actually at Breakpoint a few weeks ago doing a debate with Helium Foundation CEO on if DePIN is actually capital efficient. Matt was a bit more skeptical on this. I wanted to hear if you could reiterate your argument there, and then kind of hear Scott's potential counter argument there.
Sure. Yeah. So for those of you who hadn't seen it or weren't there, we had a nice discussion, a very friendly discussion with the Helium's CEO. And my point was basically that when you look at what DePIN is trying to do, it's trying to do something that feels a little bit like a cooperative, right? Like structure where labor is owning the product of its labor, right? The people who are supplying contributions to this network own the network. Well, if you look across the economy, what you often see is that there are two things that matter. I alluded to them earlier, monitoring capital costs. So my example is a law firm, right? Why is a law firm often a partnership or a co-op? Because everybody's a lawyer and you can look at what other people are doing. And they're billed by the hour, so you can pretty well meter the economic contribution. And then capital costs are low because you need a computer and a paper and a pen. And so like this kind of like DLIN, decentralized legal infrastructure would maybe be the ideal case in some sense of why you'd want to evaluate or how you'd want to evaluate a DePIN project against those two main things, because that's when these things seem to exist in the real economy or not. And so my skeptical case about it was just that like often projects will fall short on one of these two things, and I'll look for them to have really considered both of these really, really well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think as far as the capital efficiency side, so one of the benefits around DePIN is again the kind of like the no rent, no labor model. So I always kind of use Airbnb as that analogy of it's a cheaper way to run a hospitality business because you don't own the real estate and you're not considering all those ongoing operational costs. Where if you're able to build a wireless network from the ground up with mostly commodity hardware that's hundreds or thousands of dollars, if not in the hundreds of thousands, you're talking about far lower capital expenditure and something that can be deployed with much more localized empathy in terms of where that connectivity needs to be. Now, to Matt's point, I think the monitoring costs are significant, and one of the, again, I'll use the Airbnb analogy of think about the quality of service, where I think there's been a swing back with hotels of some people want to say in a full service hotel versus what does that monitoring cost look like on a kind of per stay basis. I think the same thing is going to be true in the long term for DePINs is, how do we think about those monitoring costs? How do you think about the management of that? I think that's the wrestle with, centralized versus decentralized operations. And, conceptually, DePIN should be more capital efficient because the economics are there to incentivize a supportive supply side. And once you have significant demand, like that flywheel works and it's a self-sustaining network. You have enough commercial organizations relying on it, it self-sustains. But I think that's one of the things that we're going to have to hold, each team, each protocol holds itself accountable to is, are we actually thinking about the monitoring costs and is quality of service there in the long term?
And if I could just say, that's an area of alignment for sure. I think on the capital cost side, one way to make capital costs really cheap is to make them zero, right? Which is to use existing infrastructure. That's the sort of Airbnb thesis, right? You just have a spare room, why not rent it out? So in that sense, like you could imagine the capital cost is high because you have to get a new building, but no, you already have it. You just have the spare room. Yeah. I do think the Airbnb point is really interesting, especially what you alluded to with, the fact that maybe people are preferring hotels. It turns out maybe there are some economies of scale in cleaning rooms, for instance, and people don't like to be billed and paid individual fees. And in that case, that probably does sit on a monitoring cost side, right? Yeah. Like what Airbnb doesn't have visibility into how people treated the room and so on, and so they can't meter that. So you have to get an outside service. But look, I think we're both in agreement that if a DePIN project succeeds on the level of an Airbnb, we're all happy, right? So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'd also love to hear from David, maybe more on what you're working on Pipe. How do you think about capital efficiency gains through DePIN?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. For example, if a new incumbent was to come into the CDN industry, you would need like $800 million to get a footprint to have global scale. And it's very fascinating. So 2 weeks ago, we kind of announced coming out of stealth, we're getting like 200 or 300 signups an hour to run infrastructure around the globe. And from like a capital efficiency, there's a lot of partners coming in that understand like CapEx write-offs. They want to run like a rack or two in various geographic areas. So for us, we see like this really great combination of like latent like compute and bandwidth from like individuals' homes to like real businesses wanting to come in and provide the services. Also, a lot of people were getting ready to run pilots with these like legacy media companies, and they're actually interested in participating and running part of the infrastructure themselves. It's very unique for us.
Great. I also want to talk a bit. We're seeing, Web 2 founders coming to DePIN solve problems. I'd say Helium's also more solving like a traditional infrastructure problem. From like a TradFi investor's perspective, what merits might DePIN have, and like, do you see more larger traditional finance institutions coming in, and what do they really need to see for them to come in more? We'll start with Matt.
From a TradFi investor's perspective,
yeah.
Well, I'll have to imagine. I guess from a TradFi, one of the things that DePIN can obviously offer, at least in theory, right, is you can see some user growth metrics right off the bat, and you can benchmark them against maybe existing technologies in many of the cases. And so that can be a good thing or a bad thing, right? In venture, we're obviously used to making longer term sort of outlay bets, and so it isn't necessarily always the case that we insist on seeing these metrics, right? You can have terrible unit economics until you don't. But that said, it's always a plus, right? And so that's something that can make, I would say, that can at least give you more confidence in certain investments, right? And I think that's something that's definitely really helpful about DePIN from an investor's perspective.
Great. I'll adjust the question a bit for Scott and David. how do you kind of pitch DePIN to, either a phone carrier or to maybe a media partner for a CDN side? How do you kind of pitch that technology?
Yeah, I think that's one thing that's important, whether it's from an investment perspective or just thinking about the viability of these projects in general is, is the solution complementary and is it actually symbiotic with what exists in the world right now? So you're thinking, I'll speak from the perspective of wireless. The way that, so like right now, I think in the last 3 months, I think it's nearly 90 terabytes of data from traditional carriers is being offloaded into Helium. Now, roaming into other coverage, like that's very, very common in the telco world. Like if you're in an airport, you're not necessarily, even if you're a Verizon customer, you're not necessarily in Verizon's coverage. They're roaming into Boingo or GoGo, like somebody else owns that coverage in the airport. So the concept and the idea of roaming, it already exists. It's not that you have to make some cognitive leap to something that's new. So the idea that it is symbiotic to an existing infrastructure model, it allows you to work with who might be your kind of moonshot competitors down the road of, can Helium compete with the likes of an AT&T and Verizon? Like, yes, in the long term, but also in the near term, it's a roaming part. Like it's very, very symbiotic. And I think that that's the idea of how do you get that initial traction where you don't have to, it's not a Rube Goldberg way of kind of working yourself into traditional legacy in Web 2. And I think that's really important in terms of how you fit in there. So the fewer cognitive leaps, the better, I think is important. Pass off David, because I could probably keep going on that thread.
Okay. David, I'd love to get your perspective too. Just, media companies or any partnerships you have with your network and more legacy traditional industries. How do you kind of explain DePIN to them?
Yeah, for us, we primarily start with the product of like low latency CDN. Essentially, we work backwards from like product market fit. We knew what the customers want. Like they measure CDNs based on latency, and DePIN allows us to deploy at scale much closer to the users. So essentially, people in the media and entertainment industry were ready to test the product before we built it. It's very exciting, but also like very complicated to build out like a supply side to support, very large media and entertainment industry.
Gotcha. Also want to talk a bit about verification. Obviously, it can be a challenge. Sometimes there's centralized points of friction. We can't fully do it in a decentralized way. What are the best approaches that we're seeing right now to verification, and what do you think might be the best approach in the future? I guess we can start with Scott.
Yeah, so the way, it's absolutely, Matt kind of alluded to, so like the monitoring part matters as far as, you're validating the supply side for wireless is very much like, is the coverage there and it's valid? And that's where we've seen a lot of success on the mobile side of Helium. So Helium, again, for those who don't know, like there's effectively two networks of power, one for IoT and low power devices, and then mobile, which is more of a cell phone use case. And the idea that you leverage your demand side for that, and create economic incentives that tie into it. So, for our IoT network, so Demo, actually, a lot of their devices run and use the Helium IoT network for connectivity. On one hand, it happens to be that, they're earning Demo rewards for doing that, but that's where some of these projects can be working together. And I think that's opportunities for partnership, but I think you need to either think about, and again, it's where I subscribe to the progressive decentralization. To one extent, the OpCo is going to own that responsibility, but over time that you can create the economic incentives to continue to value your supply side. It's kind of such a nuanced thing by project, but absolutely, how do you sustain that? And if you can create economic incentives and build that into your protocol, it's kind of the most likely path to success. But we've definitely been seeing success of Helium subscribers using that. We're seeing the connectivity is there, so it shows in real time.
Yeah.
I would say, the verification problem is kind of the reason why, in general, I'm a DePIN skeptic across the category as the name of a category, just because it's not a problem you can solve in general as far as we can tell, but there are projects that can do it well. And so, to your question, what's a good example? There's a company called the most recent I saw that I thought did a good job was called Hyperbolic. It's sort of a decentralized compute, and one of our Catalyze fellows, we have a fellowship for promising PhDs where we get them to work on a research project. And one of them was his Columbia PhD named Xiao Wang, and he came up with proof of sampling, which is this nice sort of game theoretic way to check that computation was okay and slash if it wasn't, right? And it's pretty elegant little framework, and that was a good one that works in that specific use case in that specific model. But generally, there's no answer. So you really do have to do the work and go case by case and figure out which ones make sense and which ones don't.
Here. I think for my use case, the industry we're focusing on, like, so these like Hollywood, media and entertainment, they have very strict requirements for like security verification already. So essentially we're building that in. Like, for example, if you're going to stream like Winnie the Pooh from Disney, you're going to have like a signed URL created for that individual user and for that specific content that expires within like 2 or 3 hours. So for us, like verifications at the ground level of like making sure the nodes aren't downloading data from themselves and, you know, exploiting the DePIN network itself. So without verification, in my perspective, DePIN doesn't make any sense.
Okay, to finish up, want to ask, what do you see as the largest challenge or constraint in building your network or for DePIN more broadly, and how do you overcome that? Start with David.
I think for us, especially like where we're coming from the media and entertainment and previously exited to AWS, like we have all the connections and essentially we're in this really bizarre scenario, I think, in Web3 where we've got a lot of demand interest right now and we have to build out very specific like geographic scarcity of the node so that the network can operate efficiently.
Yeah. I mean, I would say the biggest challenge is, right, just finding solves to these two issues that work, but I would really love them to be done in the most ambitious possible projects. I mean, there's nothing you'd like to see more than something that was tackling a really big physical infrastructure sort of problem and had properly paid attention to these two issues. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think not to keep beating the drum, but I think that we both kind of agree on the monitoring thing like matters very much, but also where a lot of these networks were solved through kind of cold start and incentives to create a supply side, like the demand side has to really make sure these networks are economically sustainable. So the fact that, you know, for Helium that we are seeing such incredible growth, not just on a subscriber side through the Helium Mobile as a native product, but the idea that now very traditional, very entrenched legacy institutions are starting to use the network and that the proof is there, just to continue to see that and show the viability and the durability, I think that's going to kind of speak for itself over time. So I think it's very exciting times ahead.
Great, thank you. That's all the time we have. Maybe you could just briefly say where you can find your contact information or reach out to learn more.
So you can check out pipe.network. We're getting ready to announce our testnet very soon, and you know, sign up to use the network to deliver data or sign up to run a node would be great.
Yeah, I'm at Pantera Capital. You can find our content widely, but me personally, I'm Stevenson H. Matt on Twitter. It's just my last name, middle initial, first name. But connect with me on there.
Yep, I would say start at helium.com. If you have questions for Foundation, just hello@helium.foundation. But yeah, always eager to work with other DePIN teams and kind of figure out where we can help. We've been doing this for several years, so we've learned a lot and a lot of stuff that we can do together with other protocols.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.